January 1903, Enid, Oklahoma. A man lies dying in a modest hotel room. He's a drifter, a house painter. His name is David E. George, and with his final breaths, he says something no one expects. I am John Wilkes Booth, the man who assassinated Abraham Lincoln, the man who, according to every textbook, was shot and killed nearly 40 years earlier. But what if he wasn't? What if Booth escaped that Virginia barn and lived under a dozen names, hiding in plain sight until the end? And what if the evidence to prove it was mummified? Thanks for listening to Legends May Live. Today we're looking at the deathbed confession of a man who claims to have been John Wilkes Booth. But what does the evidence say? We'll dive deep and find out. But first, a quick note that all of our stories are based on true or allegedly true accounts. But sometimes we may add details to fill gaps or have to choose between conflicting accounts. So just take this as entertainment, not a documentary. It's January 1903. A bitter chill settled over the streets of Enid, Oklahoma. The kind of still cold that settles into your bones. In a rented room above an old drugstore, a man lies dying. His name, or at least the one that he gave, is David E. George. He's a house painter by trade and lives an utterly quiet and unremarkable life. He lives much like a drifter and mostly keeps to himself. No one really knew of any family or friends of David, but as far as anyone could tell, there were none. What he did have was secrets, and now, as the end closes in, one of them is clawing its way out. He had been found by hotel staff and brought to his room after he attempted to end his own life by ingesting strychnine. They did what they could, but there was no saving him. The Reverend was called and comes quickly to David's side. David's hands tremble. His breaths are short and ragged. And as the Reverend leans closer to offer last rites, George grabs his sleeve with surprising strength. Then, David George says something that stunned everyone. I am John Wilkes Booth. It's not the first time he's alluded to David being an alias. Locals had whispered for years that the quiet drifter was more than he appeared. Sometimes, after a few drinks, he would drop hints. He'd talk about secret escapes, about masks and aliases, and once he even claimed to be haunted by a man he killed. But now, in his final moments, the name falls from his lips. John Wilkes Booth, the man who assassinated President Abraham Lincoln nearly 4 decades earlier. According to history, Booth died in Virginia barn in 1865. Trapped by Union soldiers, he refused to surrender. They set the barn ablaze and a single gunshot rang out. He was dragged out from the flames, paralyzed and dying. Hours later, he was gone, buried in secret, case closed and done. But David George just reopened the case. And what followed his death would spark over a century of whispers, headlines, and even a traveling mummy. On April 4th, 1865, just after 10:15 p.m., Ford's Theater is packed, and President Abraham Lincoln is seated in the presidential box with his wife, Mary Todd. Everyone's gathered to watch a comedy play, Our American Cousin. It's a light-hearted night filled with laughs, until from the balcony, a single gunshot rings out through the theater. The audience looks up, at first thinking this is all part of the play, but then a man drops from the balcony onto the stage, breaking his leg in the fall. And before he leaves, he shouts something people will debate for years. Sic semper tyrannis, meaning thus always to tyrants. Then he runs as best as he can on his injured leg, out the back door and climbs onto the back of an already waiting horse. And just like that, the most infamous man in America disappears into the night before anyone can really process what's happened. But John Wilkes Booth wasn't just an assassin. He was a professional actor. In fact, He was a well-known Southern celebrity, and in his own mind, a patriot. Booth believed that he had just struck a blow for the Confederacy and that Lincoln's death would ignite the new Southern uprising. Instead, it triggered the largest manhunt in American history up to that point. Over the next 12 days, Union soldiers, detectives, and vigilantes scoured the countryside. Booth fled south through Maryland, then into Virginia, still nursing his broken leg. He was helped by Confederate sympathizers, slipping through swamps and riding by night. But before long, he started to grow paranoid and became somewhat delusional. He scribbled fevered thoughts in a diary. Our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done, and I have done it. But justice was closing in. Booth and co-conspirator David Harold eventually take shelter in a tobacco barn on the Garrett Farm in Port Royal, Virginia. But Union troops would soon close in. When they arrived, the Union troops shouted for them to surrender, or that they would burn the barn down. Harold gives himself up, but Booth knows he's as good as dead if he goes out there. So rather than surrender to the noose, he continues to shelter inside the barn. And then, flames. The whole thing is starting to go up in flames. Finally, a shot rings out, and a single bullet pierces the darkness and hits Booth in the neck. He's dragged out from the burning barn, paralyzed, barely alive, and just hours later, he's dead. Or so the story goes. His body is rushed to Washington, not to be displayed, and not for public justice, but for control. It's placed on a Navy ship under armed guard. There's no public viewing, no photographs, no press, just a quick autopsy and a grave no one would visit. But years later, the corpse is quietly reburied in the Booth family plot in Baltimore. Still without fanfare, only a select few were allowed to see the body. And that's where the official story ends. John Wilkes Booth, dead at 26, the man who killed Lincoln, the traitor, the actor, the martyr of his own cause. Except, what if it wasn't him? What if the man lying in that burning barn wasn't John Wilkes Booth at all? Back to Enid, Oklahoma, January 1903. The man calling himself David E. George has died, alone in a borrowed bed above the Grand Avenue drugstore. But his final words are still echoing. I am John Wilkes Booth. At first, no one believes it. Why would the most wanted man in American history, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln, end up here in this forgotten western town painting houses and hiding in plain sight? But then the rumors start to stick. Two local men came forward. Reverend Enoch Harper, who administered George's last rites, and Finis L. Bates, a former Memphis lawyer who once knew a man named St. John Helen, a man who also claimed to be Booth. They both say the same thing. This isn't the first time David E. George has claimed that name. In fact, decades earlier, when he lived in Texas under the alias John St. Helen, this same man once fell seriously ill. Thinking death was near, he made a startling confession to Bates. He said, I am not who you think I am. I am John Wilkes Booth. He begged his lawyer to protect him, claimed the government had killed the wrong man, that he'd escaped through a burning barn, with help. And when St. Helen recovered, he tried to take it all back. He said it was just fevered nonsense. But Bates never forgot. Now, decades later, the same man dies in Enid, and makes the same confession. Bates rushes to Oklahoma. He identifies the body, and he quickly confirms, this is the man he knew as John St. Helen. This is, he said, John Wilkes Booth. But rather than bury him, his body is embalmed, preserved, and then put on display. Displayed standing upright in a glass case, the embalmed corpse of David E. George becomes a sideshow attraction, a traveling exhibit known as The Man Who Killed Lincoln. He tours the country, appears in circus tents, dime museums, and roadside attractions. Thousands come to see him, gawking at the twisted, sunken face and withered hands. The mummy, still wearing remnants of a suit, is said to have a crushed or deformed thumb, scarred neck, and a broken leg improperly healed, all matching John Wilkes Booth's known injuries. Even the build and height are eerily close. And then, several people who knew Booth, actors, Confederate allies, even Booth's own dentist, come forward to say, yes, that's him. That's Booth. In 1907, Finis L. Bates publishes a book, The Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth. Inside, he lays out the entire case, the switch in the barn, the escape through Texas, the aliases, and the final confession. The book causes a sensation, and it sells thousands of copies, and more importantly, it plants a seed of doubt. If the government got Booth's death wrong, what else might they have been wrong about? Still, skeptics called it a hoax. They said that Bates was chasing fame and the corpse was just a look-alike. But the evidence lingered, and the mummy, that grotesque, leathery relic of a man, would travel the country for nearly 60 years. Back on April 26, 1865, after 12 days on the run, Union troops surrounded a weathered tobacco barn on the Garrett farm. They believed John Wilkes Booth was inside. They set the barn on fire, and one man surrendered while the other refused. A single shot, fired by Sergeant Boston Corbet, ends the standoff, and the man inside is pulled from the burning embers, paralyzed, gasping, and fading fast. Union officials say it was Booth, and the case closed. But from the very beginning, something just didn't sit right. Several people present that night, soldiers, doctors, and civilians, later made statements that raised serious questions. Some said that the man looked older than Booth and that he had red hair, not black. They said that he didn't have the tattoo Booth was known to have on his right hand, JWB. And then there's dental evidence. When Booth's body was exhumed in 1869 to be reburied in the family plot, dental molds were allegedly used to confirm its identity. But those molds were never preserved, and no one can verify they existed at all. The entire process of Booth's death was cloaked in secrecy, with no public viewing, no official photograph of the corpse. The autopsy was conducted on a monitor-covered ship, the USS Montauk, under heavy guard. The body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Washington Arsenal Penitentiary grounds. Even Booth's own mother and brother were not allowed to see the body at the time. Later, when the body was transferred to the family plot in Baltimore, only a handful of people were allowed to view the remains, and some of them said that the body that was exhumed was not Booth. One theory suggests that the man killed in the barn wasn't Booth at all, but James William Boyd. Boyd was a former Confederate soldier who bore a striking resemblance to Booth, and crucially, he had been arrested days earlier by Union forces, but was released under mysterious circumstances. Some believe Boyd was used as a stand-in, that Union officials deliberately let Booth escape, then killed Boyd and passed him off as Booth, because the country needed closure. Lincoln was dead, the war was ending, the public demanded justice, and the government needed the story wrapped up right away. If that's true, then John Wilkes Booth disappeared into the American wilderness, alive and free. He lived as a ghost of history, reshaping his face, his name, and his past, until one day, decades later, he dies in an Oklahoma hotel. After David E. George died in 1903, Finis L. Bates claimed the body as it traveled around the carnivals, sideshows, and dime museums. People paid to see him, to look at the corpse up close, and over the years, dozens of people claimed to examine the body. Doctors, historians, handwriting experts, even actors who once shared the stage with Booth. And while the scars, thumb, leg, and build matched Booth's body, even the handwriting experts started testing. A few forensic experts conducted handwriting comparisons using letters written by Booth and others by John St. Helen. They called the matches highly probable. The mummy became such a big sensation that at one point it was insured for $1 million. It continued to tour and appeared in traveling exhibits, oddity expos, and world fairs. It was kept in basements, back rooms, and wax museums, even stolen once, only to be recovered and quietly returned. Eventually, the body was offered up for sale in the 1970s, but no museum would take it. Then, shortly after that, it vanished into the shadowy world of private collections. Rumors swirl that it still exists, lying in some forgotten case in an attic or warehouse, and truthfully, it does almost certainly still exist, whether buried or otherwise. At this point, we have a confession, a preserved corpse that those who knew him say is Booth, medical similarities, a suspicious backstory, and a timeline that works if Booth escaped. But no DNA, no final proof, just a mummy that haunted the American consciousness for decades, and a question that refuses to die. Who was the man in that case? Let's go back to the night of April 26, 1865. A barn burns in Port Royal. A man is shot. The country is told Booth is dead. But why was there no public display of the body? Why was the autopsy conducted under heavy military guard on a warship? Why was the body buried in secret, then quietly moved years later? Why were there no photographs, despite Booth being the most wanted man in American history? The country was still raw. Lincoln had just been assassinated. Tensions were still smoldering across the South. The public needed closure, and the government needed the clean story. A drawn-out trial, or worse, that the idea that Booth had escaped, could reignite rebellion. So they gave the people what they wanted: a dead villain and a closed case. It was neat, simple, and final, even if it wasn't entirely true. But was it true? Had John Wilkes Booth been killed? Some government officials privately expressed doubts, even back then. A Union intelligence officer named Lafayette Baker reportedly kept documents suggesting that Booth may have escaped. Some were stolen from his office before his sudden, mysterious death. His cousin later claimed he found a coded diary referencing Booth still alive years later after 1865. And then there's the strange inconsistencies in the burial records. They seem to show two different bodies were logged and exhumed during the post-war years. But anytime someone tried to push for a re-investigation, the answer was the same: no, let it go. In the 1990s, descendants of the Booth's family petitioned the government to exhume Booth's brother Edwin, whose remains are verified, so that they could do a DNA comparison with the man buried as Booth. The government firmly denied the request, saying that it would set a bad precedent. But if the story was airtight, and the body in the Booth family plot was truly John Wilkes Booth, why not confirm it? Why protect the myth that Booth really escaped that night in 1865? David E. George, or John St. Helen, or whoever he truly was, died alone in a dusty Oklahoma room in 1903. He didn't ask for attention. He didn't sell his story to newspapers or demand a crowd. He just whispered a name, as if he couldn't hold it any longer. A deathbed confession that history may have been rewritten by design. So what do you believe? Did John Wilkes Booth die in a burning barn in 1865? Or did he vanish, shedding one identity and stepping into another? Maybe the truth was buried, or maybe it's still out there, packed away in a private collection. That's it for today's story. Thanks for listening to Legends May Live. If you enjoyed today's episode, please drop a like, follow, and share it with a friend. Until next time, keep a lookout and stay alert. You never know who you may be talking to.